All right, this is a wonky talk, but you all are honorary wonks because you're here in this room and you care about the river. There are a lot of numbers here, and let's get started. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about how we got to our current status, what's happened with these big reservoirs, what's going on with hydrology and operations since both 2000 when the drought started and 2007 when the interim guidelines were put into place. Climate change is still here and it's getting worse, and Jeff's talk actually put together some numbers I have not seen, but I'm not surprised. Problems and challenges post-2007 include inflated demands in our modeling, problems with what's called intentionally created surplus, problems with manipulating this system. They're both good and bad manipulations, and also our evolving understanding of climate change. I'm going to question some of these rules that put in place in 2007 and suggest we could simplify many of them, and then I'm going to conclude. So 2018-19, it's a big water year. You can see Lake Powell's increase over there on the far right, but it's not as big as 2011. 20 million acre feet in 2011. Jeff suggested 17.5, maybe 18. This year's a lot more like 2005, which is in the gray left-hand side of this image, the gray indicating post-2007. It's fully 10% less than 2011, and it's only 1 year after this record dry and record warm 2018. And I say it's unlikely to be our future. In some ways it is. It's this wet year that shows up, but generates much less runoff than we expect. It's an example of what Dan Swain in California calls weather whiplash. And I'll note, we can and do set cold records around the planet with climate change. The current ratio is one cold record for about every 2 warm ones. But as it continues to warm, those numbers will get to something like 1 to 20 by 2050 and 1 to 40 perhaps by 2100, depending on how much it warms. Lake Powell's up only 20 feet year over year, and you can see it right there. That vertical arrow goes August 1 to August 1, and they're now 55% of full. Just a personal note, last week I had the privilege of walking in the Wind Rivers for a week in Wyoming, in the Green River part of the drainage. And in the left there, you can see they had a good year, not a great year, more than 100%. That lower photo I took at 10,000 feet, dry as a bone. Any creek less than 5 feet wide was totally dry, and the bigger creeks 10 feet and wider were full of algae and very much depleted. And the reason is shown there on the left, this evaporative demand index. It's actually off of Jeff's site, the WWA Climate Dashboard. You can see that record-setting ED4 evaporative load that dried out this whole basin in the latter part of the year, our water year. There's combined contents of Mead and Powell, 2000 to 2019, and you can see the blip there on the far right. That's what 2019 did. Again, a lot more like 2005 than 2011. So 46 million acre feet in this system in 2000, 24 million by 2019. That's a decline of about 22 million acre feet, or roughly 50%. And there are 4 periods here. So 2000 to 2004, we lost 23 million acre feet. Look at that decline. And the average inflows are under 2/3 of normal, so 9.5 million acre feet per year. Don't think that this can't happen again, right? That hydrology right now creates huge problems for water management were it to occur. From 2005 to 2011, basically flat. We gained about 1 million acre feet. 2011, we went up 6 with that huge 20 million acre foot year. From 2012 to 2019, we lost 6 million acre feet. And the average flows in that period are about 12.5 million. In the worst years, the system loses about 5 million acre feet per year. In the best years, we gain slightly more, about 6 million acre feet. It would take 4 2011 type years in a row to refill the system to back to 2000 levels. And the hydrology from 2000 to 2007 is 2.4 million acre feet per year, worse than 2008 to 2018, and you can see it right there. So what happened to Lake Mead? So these different colors represent different shortage elevations, starting in blue, the aqua there in the upper part of the graph, there's no shortages. So it lost 15 million acre feet, or about 2/3 of that 22 million that we lost in total. Averages about 800,000 acre feet per year, and about 40% remains in that huge reservoir. 25 million acre feet at the beginning, 10 now. 4 periods. So you have a 12-year period there from 2000 to 2011, you lose 15 million acre feet. That's your structural deficit in action, where lower basin overuse comes into play. 1.4 million acre feet per year loss. 2011, they get the bonus water out of equalization. Powell gets so high, right, the rules say we release a slug of water out. It gains 5 million acre feet. Guess what? We lose that in 3 short years. By 2014, we're way back to where we were at the beginning. We've lost it all. And then since 2014, the reservoir levels there have stabilized. They're hanging in right around 1090. And why is that? Because they've had the benefit of large releases out of Lake Powell, 9 million acre feet, and they've also reduced their demand somewhat. And it's interesting to speculate what might have happened since 2014 if the DCP, the Drought Contingency Plan, had been in place, because it would require roughly 300,000 acre foot per year reductions in demand, and hence the reservoir would be higher. So you all are concerned, as I am, about what happens at Powell. And you may recollect from your history that when the Central Arizona Project Act was passed in 1968, there were no operational rules for how to operate the 2 big reservoirs, Powell and Mead. And that 1968 Act put in place the way by which reclamation would establish these rules. And by the early 1970s, reclamation had put in place this 8.23 million acre foot minimum objective release out of Powell. And this graph shows the relative size of that release from Powell, starting in the year 2000, going to 2019. And the 0 line there represents an 8.23 million acre foot release, to give you an idea. So the 1 bar below in 2014, that's a 7.48 million acre foot release. And the red line shows you cumulative releases over that time. Note that in 2007, again, the rules of the game changed, and that's when the guidelines went into place. So since 2000, 13 million acre feet total above that 8.23 have been released from Powell. And if you discount from 2007, there's only 11 million acre feet. One of those years that I previously talked about is at 7.48. 4 years were at 8.23, and they're the 4 that are listed. You can see them there, 2012, 2013, 2009, and 2010. 5 years, the last 5, are all at that 9 million acre foot bonus water, if you will, that keeps propping up Lake Mead. And then there are 2 equalization years that occurred, 2008 and 2011. 2011 didn't get the whole job done, so it actually spilled over into 2012, hence the bigger bar there in 2012 than otherwise you would think should be. So what's this mean? It means that 60% of these years, 7 out of 12 since 2007, are at 9 million acre feet. 4 out of 12, or 1/3, are at that 8.23, that old target, and 1 out of 12 less than 8.23. That's part of the reason why Powell is so low, right? And it's part of the reason why Mead has actually managed to stay in the ball game since 2014. All right, let me shift gears, talk a little bit about climate change. This is 2018, and those dark red colors are the driest and warmest years in NOAA's complete data set going back to 1895. That's the future right there on the right, the warmest temps, right? Our ability to predict precipitation's far less certain, but boy, when it gets dry, it can get really dry under this new regime we're operating. 21st century warmth is going to be unlike anything we've seen, and in fact, it's outside our ken, frankly. So these images here are model runs, and they start back in the 1950s and go fully to the end of the 21st century, and let me walk you through them. That green cloud represents, each little square pixel there represents a model run. The blue axes represent the 10 to 90th percentile, so the central tendency, if you will, of that cloud of models. Wet and dry is on the horizontal axis, and then temperature is on the vertical axis. And you can see 1950 to 1980, basically, we're kind of centered on the 0 wet to dry and 0 temperature average. Those red dots are recent dry years, and they're going to stay put, and that cloud is going to move through time as it warms up. So here's 1980 to 2010 out of the climate models. It has subtly shifted up, right? Those red dots are now closer to that blue horizontal line. Here's mid-century out of the climate model runs. The whole cloud is now up, right? It's now warmer. It hasn't particularly shifted much wet to dry, although there's a little tendency to go further left, as evidenced by that longer blue horizontal line to the left. And the red dots now are on the very cool side. These warm years, they're now cool in 2050. And here's the end century. Guess what? Those red dots aren't even what the models can reproduce. Those red dots, they're too cold to occur, relatively too cold to occur, despite the fact that they're close to record setting right now. Hence my idea that this 21st century warmth is unlike anything we've seen in the historic record. And you'll note here that the blue horizontal line, mid-century and end century, starts to extend out a little bit to the left, giving a hint here of these really wet years that we can see on occasion. And as Jeff pointed out this morning, it's not clear, and I would say in fact, it's clear that all of that extra precip doesn't turn into runoff, it turns into more evaporation. So what are some of the problems and challenges post 2007 in the interim guidelines? First, I'm going to dig at the folks that created these things, and I know there's some reclamation folks here. No offense intended. A lot of good thought went into these rules, and you have to start somewhere. Hindsight's always 20/20, but I just want to pick some nits with how we set this system in place. And acknowledge that, as an academic, I sit in the cheap seats. The cost of me saying something wrong is usually pretty low. Some of my solutions might create other problems, but I do hope that there's some useful thoughts here, perhaps for the 2026 renegotiations. So these next thoughts actually come courtesy of Eric Kuhn, and I want to acknowledge his authorship of this, although he can always deny it and say that I got it wrong. But my point here is that inflated demands in our models actually can lead to bad outcomes. And in 2012, during what was called the basin study, this big effort by reclamation to try and look at the future of the basin, two environmental NGOs sent a letter to reclamation saying, hey, you guys have demands from the states that are way out of whack. They're too high. And there were, in theory, 6 different storylines that reclamation studied in 2012 with varying levels of conservation. And some of these demands that were supplied by the states were actually higher in the conservation scenarios than in the normal scenarios. Many of the demands were not updated to the best information, and one state had growth of 150% by 2030, despite only 1% per year at the time. Another state had an increase of demand, in these demands of 35% over 4 years in a large metropolitan area that clearly was not going to happen. So if you have too high of these demands that we put in our models, you end up with model world impacts. And this iconic figure that has been shown hundreds of times in Colorado River talks, now one has to look at it a little bit askew, right? I mean, look at the projected demands there going up. There are a lot of folks that think that actually demands are unlikely to go up that much, and that's a direct result of these inflated demands supplied by the states. And it also skewed the options and strategies that reclamation studied to try and resolve this imbalance. If you have too high demands, you also get real-world impacts. And this is some of Eric's suggestions. So I pointed out earlier that from Powell, we can release 7.48 million acre feet, 8.23, 9 million acre feet. We can equalize, right? Those are some of the rules out of the 2007 guidelines. And after that huge drop in Powell, you can see it there in gray, the upper basin wanted to hedge the risk of the potential of future years that created that with bigger years. They wanted the ability to release 7.48 and protect Powell. But the modeling that was done with these higher demands. Those higher demands drove Powell lower, right? And these colors here, that blue area, typically in model world, you release 8.23, and in that pink area, you release 7.48. If you think about it, if your model's got higher demands, it's going to force Powell out of that blue area down into the pink area where it will release less. And at least according to Eric, if I get this right, that's part of the reason we ended up with this system right now that leads to these greater releases than Powell than I think a lot of people in this room are comfortable with. It's these demands that are too high. And I'll note that Reclamation has recently modified these demands for some of their drought contingency effort. All right, so let's talk ICS. How many folks know I intentionally created surplus? Come on, there are a few wonks out there. All right, so pre-2007, if you were in the lower basin and you did not want to use your water that year and you wanted to store it, you were out of luck. It just got put in the pool for allocation next year. It was a version of use it or lose it. And one of the ideas in 2007, and I'd argue this was good, was this idea of intentionally created surplus. If you were using water, legitimately using it, and you could prove that in 1 year you weren't going to use it, so not just a paper right, but you literally you could show you could use this water, you could then put it in Mead and put your name on it. It had a name, intentionally created surplus. And there were 4 types. I'm not going to bother with the fact they're different kinds, but there are 4 types. And we've now created a new type in the DCP. And so the creation of this actually promoted to some degree conservation, right? It encouraged people to not use water and bank it for later. So creating this ICS, they created 2 problems, I would argue. One, the rules in 2007 said if Mead dropped below 1075, you actually then couldn't get access to it. Well, guess what that means? It means exactly what this newspaper article talks about. If your metropolitan water district and the reservoir is getting close to 1075 and you have a bunch of ICS, you think long and hard about stranding it and you think about getting it out, which doesn't protect the reservoir, one of the whole purposes behind the 2007 effort. And under the new DCP rules, that's been changed. You can actually get ICS down to 1025. So the concept of ICS has the potential to make these low reservoir elevations actually worse by encouraging people to take water out when the reservoir is actually dropping low already. And I call that the bank run problem. So the one thing I will say about ICS is that many people point to it and say we've promoted real conservation here. And I'd argue, well, you've saved water, but you're really trying to shift its use in time, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But it at times seems like it's an effort to maximize use from this system. And I'll get into the details of this in a minute or two. So in 2007, to solve the structural deficit, the lower basin states, and especially Arizona, agreed to take roughly 600,000 acre-feet of shortages out of the 1.2 million acre-foot structural deficit, or about 50%. By 2013, when Mead had dropped again precipitously following the equalization, there was real worry that those 2007 rules didn't do enough, and hence the DCP effort came along to try and get this resolved. And the idea was we need to get fully 1.2 million acre-feet of shortages in place to protect Mead from bottoming out. When one looks at a table right now of the DCP shortages, you actually see 1.4 million acre-feet of shortages, and you feel pretty good about it. Well, that's not the whole story behind the DCP. DCP created a whole new form of ICS. So unlike the 2007 shortages, which are gone, once those were, if they were ever put in place, you won't get to claim those later. Under the DCP rules, you actually get a credit for all that water you didn't use. And if Lake Mead post these shortages then arises to the level of 11 million acre-feet, you then can take that credit out again. So you can see you really haven't solved the structural deficit, right? You've just shifted use in time again. And the worry here is that this DCP intentionally created surplus, at least my worry, is that we've actually created an issue where the reservoir is starting to recover at 40% full, and all of a sudden, all that DCP foregone water, it's now available for lower basin entities to take again. And that certainly bothers me. I would agree in general, ICS is a benefit. Use it or lose it, frankly, is not such a great thing, as I suspect a lot of you folks in this room could acknowledge. But the devil's in the details of how it gets actually administered. So one simple ICS solution is when we determine a shortage in the lower basin, this intentionally created surplus is counted as part of the level of Lake Mead, even though it's really private water, right? We're double counting it. One simple solution, which will never happen, because these rules are set in place right now through 2026, but if you're going to have a system like that, don't count it for the purposes of determining whether or not a shortage exists. That would be my simple solution on this. ICS it's good, but right now I think it's just the thinking behind it creates more problems than at least I would like to have. And there's my simple solution. So this diagram here with the sweet spot in it was put on the Central Arizona Project website in 2017, 2018, caused quite the kerfuffle, including a very strongly worded letter out of the upper basin. And basically this diagram describes a way by which the lower basin can get a 9 million acre-foot release out of Powell if they just have if they just have Mead there at the right elevation. And you can see sweet spot, 9 million acre-foot release, and shortage at 8.23. The rules right now allow, I would argue, at least some manipulation of this system. And I'll define manipulation as actions that keep us from reaching an undesirable target. And they're good manipulations, like the pilot projects, the system conservation pilot projects that arguably have done really good things and made people think long and hard about how we use water. And then there are bad manipulations like this one, And I, again, would argue that when we set up rules like this, we need to think long and hard about the opportunity to manipulate the system, maximize opportunities for good manipulation, and obviously minimize the bad stuff. So let me talk a little bit about climate change and how our thinking is changing. In 2007, there was an Appendix U that was created for the EIS that, as far as I know, was the first attempt by Reclamation to put climate change into an EIS. Kudos to Reclamation, Terry Fulp in particular for doing this. In 2012, I think would argue we made kind of two false assumptions with climate change, that we can take this climate model output and argue that it adequately samples the future and provides a probability distribution of the future. And then I'd also argue that we overly focused on the median of that, or average of that future, and we don't know quite now what we're sampling with this climate model output. We do know natural variability is huge, and there's a suggestion that we're just looking at a portion of it. And I know Jim Prairie has recently said, and I tend to agree, maybe looking just at the minimum and the maximums of these climate models might actually be about as good information as we're going to get out of it. High temperatures are reducing these flows significantly, and this is work that Connie Woodhouse has done, that Julie Vano has done, that I've done with Overpeck, with Mu Shao and Dennis Lettenmeyer, and others have done. We saw it in Jeff's talk for 2019. This, unfortunately, is our future. And what goes on with precipitation, it's far more unknown. There's some reason to think that the southern portion of the basin dries and the north either increases or at least doesn't decrease. And it's still possible to get these big years and maybe even hopefully decades. The National Climate Assessment last year said we must manage for a water future we cannot fully foresee. I would suggest with almost all these hydrologies, we need to move away from probabilities and think about building scenarios that provide robust management at all conceivable low flows. That's really the goal here. The idea that we can probabilistically model this system and somehow dial in our management to that, I don't believe it. Let me question some of the 2007 rules. This is out of the EIS, or actually the record of decision in 2007. Again, devil in the details. That upper elevation balancing tier is that blue area in Lake Powell I've shown. Those are the rules. They may look simple. When you try and model them in a computer program, it gets pretty interesting to do. And you can see the other tiers too look simple also, but they're not when you actually put them into a computer model. I'd like to question some of the rules in 2007, and the record of decision, the ROD objectives are shown there on the right. And that one in blue talks about trying to balance the risk of upper basin issues with compact and curtailments in the lower basin. And I'd argue that in 2007, I don't think we gave enough thought to this idea of upper basin violations of the 75 million acre foot running 10-year delivery. And I say that right here. There's no real explicit consideration in those 7,000 rules of that 3D, that 75 million acre foot 10-year running average risk. And there's this fundamental tension in our Colorado River Compact between 3D and 3E. 3E being this idea the upper basin can't hoard water, that they have to share water with the lower basin if they're not using it. And one solution I might have is, given the fact the upper basin's using perhaps 60% of its 1922 ideal amount from its compact allocation, that, you know, if that number is 4.5 million, it's significantly less than 7.5 million. If the upper basin is delivering to the lower basin plenty of excess, that if for some reason it were to violate that 3D, you would want to hold, or you could hold it harmless. Some days I think these rules are too complicated, and a simple but not simplistic system would be better. And there are days I wonder if the models actually aren't running the show than humans. It's hard to understand the value of a 9 million acre foot release when Powell's 40% full, right? Yet that's where we are right now. And when one looks at how the lower basin operates this system, it seems like these rules are skewed to maximizing water deliveries rather than optimizing reliability. And here are 4 kind of examples. Again, the idea that under the DCP, these things that are called shortages, they're credits actually, they're not shortages. People potentially get them back when Lake Mead gets to only 40% full. The idea that ICS is real conservation, it shifts use in time, which is valuable, but let's not fool ourselves as to what we're actually doing. ICS recovery now allowed at really low Lake Mead levels of 1025, where there's only 4 million acre feet left in a 27 million acre foot reservoir. The rules allow for a mid-year adjustment in April if hydrology turns out different, but that adjustment only can increase the release out of Mead, not decrease it. And just, I put this in, I'm gonna skip it. It's this 3E clause that no one ever talks about, that's part of the bugaboo we're in today, that basically allows the lower basin to put some claim on unused upper basin water, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, again, devil in the details. So right now under the 2007 guidelines, the all-important date is August 15, when Reclamation releases the 24-month study. And in that, they project 4.5 months later what Lake Mead level will be. And based on that January 1 date, we then decide if we're going to have a shortage or not. And if you think about it, in some ways, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, why forecast on just one date? I mean, we know plenty about Lake Mead's elevation, right? We have historical data looking backwards, but why one date? Why not use calculated average reservoir volume? Is there a benefit to looking backward in time? Are the Powell tiers the right sizes? And then I'll note that because we have a 4.5 month lead on that from August 15th out to January 1, there's some opportunity to play a few little games here with inputs into Reclamation's model. And I'm not accusing anybody of anything underhanded here, but we know plenty on August 15 what the status of the reservoirs are. This just feels like extra complexity to me that we don't need. I mean, we might even think about using inflows as a partial trigger based on, you know, a bigger year or a smaller year combined with reservoir elevations. So let me conclude. It's a really complicated system, right? Thousands of users. Much of our storage loss was pre-2007. It was far worse hydrology. Remember that 9.5 million acre foot amount that created that decline. But we managed to lose another 10 million acre feet in storage after 2011. And for every really big year like 2011, 2019, we're getting 2012s, 13s, and 18s. Recent warm temperatures may actually be too cold to occur in 2100. And this is the one thing I'll say, it does not have to be this way. This nation has the capability right now to solve this climate change problem. We have the technology at the prices we need. We know the policy tools we need. I mean, they're in evidence everywhere. We have lacking the will right now. And the climate science community is, frankly, by the year, getting more and more vocal about the need to do something about this. In the upper basin, 2018 was horrendous, and I don't need to remind people of the room in this, but that's our future, and worse. We need to get the best possible data into these models. I mean, there's no reason for having politics deciding what data, demand data, and other goes in. You know, if I had to argue, I would tell you these inflated demands, this is the old game we used to play in the 20th century, right? Where possession was 9/10 of the law, and part of that possession was sort of trying to get your elbows out and claim more water than you would otherwise potentially even could use. I would tell you in the lower basin, I think that system skewed to maximizing deliveries at the expense of robust management at low flows, and we'll have an attempt to redo that in 2026. And we also really need to consider how humans interact with this system when we set these management rules in place so we can avoid these kind of bad manipulations that are going to happen, frankly. My preference to operate this system with as transparent, simple, and clear rules as possible. If you want these slides, they're there. They'll also be on the River District site. And with that, I'll end.
Thank you, Brad. We have time for a question or two. Might there be one? Okay. Okay. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes. On the question of climate change and how we can solve it, what about the part that, thank you. What about the part that other countries in this world play in pollution of our environment?
So climate change and solving it, what about other countries? So U.S., the world's largest economy, right? I mean, who wants to disagree that this is the greatest nation on earth? Anybody want to take me on that? All right, so next question is, if you're the greatest nation on earth, what's your role in solving this problem? I would tell you it's primary role. I would tell you that we have the technology, we have the brains. There are actually huge opportunities in this solution set. This isn't just a bummer like a lot of people think. I mean, most of these technologies actually make for a better world for all of us. So, I mean, I would tell you, this nation wants to claim the mantle of being the greatest on the planet. By God, let's live up to that. Let's show the world what we can do, and others will follow. And frankly, and to be clear, the Chinese actually they're carrying their share of the load right now, if that's your worry.
Okay, I have one more question. So, in your view, you as an observer of many things, it seems like the upper basin will want to change the rules going post-2026, and the lower basin may want to keep them in place because why not? It looks like a good deal. How do you see that working out?
You know, I'm looking forward to Doug Kenny's talk. I think there are opportunities here for win-win. I think everyone is at risk in this basin, and my idea earlier that this river brings us together, works as a whole basin, not just as a west slope, not as a state. There are solutions where everybody can give something and in return can get something better. That would be my simple, optimistic outlook.
Well, thank you for being an optimist, because Jeff sure let us down with his pessimism.